Why did the mountain go silent right before it tried to kill them? The storm didn't arrive loudly. It erased things. Sound first, distance second, then certainty. One moment the ridge line existed, solid and familiar beneath their boots, and the next it dissolved into white noise and motionless air that felt wrong. Wind screamed sideways, snow cut at exposed skin, and visibility collapsed until the man 10 feet ahead became a shadow guessing at direction. Lieutenant Commander Ava Monroe slowed, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood when the terrain was speaking faster than people could listen. Then the crack came from above. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a rifle. It was the sound of stone breaking its own rules. The mountain gave way beneath her. One heartbeat she was steady, hand lifted in a silent signal to adjust spacing. The next, the ledge collapsed as if it had been waiting for her weight. Snow and rock tore loose together, violent and sudden, swallowing space where she had stood. Ava Monroe disappeared without a sound. No scream, no warning, just absence. Miguel Alvarez lunged forward instinctively, fingers clawing for something solid, but there was nothing to grab. Only blood darkening the snow where she'd been. A broken rifle sling half buried in ice. No movement. No answer on the radio. Just static and wind howling like it was pleased with itself. She's gone. Lieutenant Ryan Calloway didn't want to say it. The words tasted wrong, like admitting gravity had stopped working. No one answered him. They stood frozen in a formation that suddenly felt hollow, as if the center had been cut out and no one knew where to look. Then the gunfire started. Single shots, deliberate, probing. Cracks from opposing ridges that felt less like an attack and more like questions being asked by someone who already knew the answers. Tyler Quinn stumbled into the formation, blood slicking his gloves, breath shallow and uneven. The medic was on him instantly, fingers working by muscle memory while his eyes said what his mouth wouldn't yet. This wasn't chaos. This was control. Before the storm closed in, Ava Monroe had moved through mountains the way she moved through everything else, quietly, deliberately, without waste. She never rushed her steps, never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The team followed her because things worked when she was in front. Signals were subtle. Corrections were brief. If she stopped, everyone stopped. If she moved, the platoon flowed with her like the terrain had shifted in her favor. Her reputation traveled faster than she did. Impossible patience. Shots taken only when they mattered. A record built not on aggression but restraint. When rounds snapped close, her breathing didn't change. When plans unraveled, her tone stayed even. Men who'd served under louder leaders learned something under her command. Calm could be lethal. Some never noticed it at first. They saw her size, the way she stood apart during briefings, the silence, the fact that she listened more than she spoke. Doubts surfaced in glances and pauses. Too reserved, too careful, too small. Ava Monroe never corrected them. She didn't need to. Ryan Calloway had watched her for nearly 2 years without realizing how much of his confidence rested on her presence. He was trained, competent, steady under pressure. But he had never been forced to decide whether to leave his commander behind. That line wasn't covered in manuals. You don't train for the moment the ground disappears and takes your certainty with it. As the team moved under fire, something fundamental shifted. Orders were still given. Weapons still came up. Discipline remained. But the gravity was gone. The center that had held everything together had vanished into the storm. Calloway made the call without looking back. He pointed downhill and ordered movement toward the emergency extraction zone. His voice stayed level. Inside, everything felt unstable. Snow packed into collars. Wind tore at balance. Visibility shrank until each man trusted the silhouette ahead of him more than his own footing. The shots followed them. Not rushed, not panicked, waiting. The terrain narrowed into a shallow ravine, rock walls closing in, snow deep enough to steal momentum with every step. The realization landed across the formation at once. This was a funnel. Alvarez swept his rifle along the ridgeline, searching for movement. Brooks stayed close, breathing too fast, eyes darting. Behind them, Quinn sagged again, legs failing as blood loss and cold conspired quietly. The medic shook his head once. Surgery within the hour, maybe less. That changed the math. Every second now carried weight. Calloway felt it settle behind his eyes like pressure. Ammunition was light, radios unreliable, no air support, no artillery, just rifles, snow, and enemies who seemed to know exactly where they were going. They're moving like us, Brooks whispered. No one corrected him, because it was true. Fire cracked from above, forcing Alvarez down. Controlled return shots bought seconds, nothing more. The enemy adjusted when they adjusted, stopped when they stopped. This wasn't reaction, it was orchestration. Brooks finally broke. We can't just leave her. Calloway didn't turn. He couldn't. If we go back, we all die here. That was the truth. It didn't make the words hurt less. Would you chase hope or protect the living? The ambush answered for them. Fire erupted from both sides, closer now, heavier. Snow exploded as rounds tore into stone. Orders came sharp and clipped. Positions were taken. Quinn was dragged into shallow cover. Calloway moved forward, exposed, because leaders didn't hide when everything was already broken. We move together, he said. We don't freeze. It wasn't inspiration. It was survival. They pushed forward, each step earned, every movement contested. The storm swallowed commands, fear, and doubt alike. Somewhere behind them, the mountain kept its secret. And somewhere above them, unseen, someone who was supposed to be dead opened her eyes. Pain came in fragments. Sound felt distant as if underwater. Ava Monroe didn't rush awareness. Breathing first, controlled, measured. Pain was information. Panic wasted time. Her ribs protested with each inhale. Her shoulder sat wrong. She reset it with a single, silent motion and let the burn spread without acknowledging it. Her radio was shattered. No comms, no one listening. She inventoried what she had left. Rifle intact, ammo limited, enough to matter, not enough to be careless. The ledge above hadn't failed naturally. The break was too clean. The realization landed hard. Well, this had been shaped. Her team was being herded. Ava Monroe didn't wonder if they thought she was dead. That question didn't help them. She moved toward the sound of gunfire, step by deliberate step, using terrain and storm like she always had. Blood soaked her side. She tightened the dressing and kept going. From a partial overlook, she saw the geometry of the fight, the funnel, the pressure, the wounded man slowing them, the enemy confident in their control. She chambered around and waited. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let the moment come to you. Why did the enemy hesitate just for a breath when they had every advantage? The pause was almost nothing, less than a second. But in combat, a second that shouldn't exist changes everything. Ryan Calloway felt it before he could explain it. The rhythm of incoming fire, steady, methodical, confident, stuttered. A gap opened where pressure should have been tightening. He lifted his head just enough to risk a glance uphill, instinct screaming at him to drop back down. A single shot cracked through the storm. Not loud, not rushed. One clean sound that cut through the wind like a blade. Then silence again. A body appeared through the snow, tumbling down the slope as if the mountain itself had rejected it. No return fire followed. No shout. No scramble. Just absence where control had been. Brenner's breath caught. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The way that shot had landed told a story all by itself. Another round followed. Different angle, same precision. Enemy fire faltered. Confusion leaked into their movements. Shouts echoed faintly through the storm, not commands but questions. Men shifted where they had been steady. Cover that had felt sufficient seconds ago suddenly felt thin. "That's not us," Brenner said quietly. Calloway didn't answer. He was listening now, counting seconds between shots, feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not relief, not hope, recognition. High above them, Ava Monroe lay prone against frozen stone, the wind clawing at her gear, snow creeping into every seam of fabric. Each breath pulled pain across her ribs, sharp and insistent, but she regulated it the same way she always had: slow in, controlled out. Her left arm burned with every adjustment of the rifle, but it held. It only needed to hold long enough. She didn't fire often. She selected it. The enemy below was skilled, disciplined, used to shaping chaos instead of drowning in it. That made them predictable in a way amateurs never were. They moved in patterns, covered arcs, trusted positions they believed unreachable. Ava let the storm hide her movements as she shifted inches at a time along the ledge, choosing angles that didn't announce themselves. Another hostile broke from cover, trying to reposition, confidence faltering into urgency. Ava waited until he committed. Then she fired. He collapsed where he stood. Below, the team felt the change ripple through the fight. Pressure eased, not because the enemy was gone, but because they were no longer certain. Discipline frayed. The mountain, moments ago a weapon against them, began to loosen its grip. Brooks risked another glance uphill, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might break his ribs from the inside. He saw movement through the thinning snow, a shape where there shouldn't have been one. High ground no one should have survived reaching. No way, he breathed. Brenner saw it too, the posture, the cadence. The way the rifle seemed to belong there, balanced and patient. He had trained with that rhythm, watched it save lives. He didn't say her name. Saying it felt dangerous, like the storm might hear and take her back. Calloway's mind raced through possibilities, none of them fitting. Another unit, unlikely. Overwatch he hadn't been briefed on, impossible. The angles were wrong, too high, too far, too deliberate. Another shot rang out. Another enemy fell. Calloway made a decision he would later realize had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with trust. "Move toward the fire," he ordered. No one questioned it. They surged forward, dragging Quinn between them, rifles snapping up as they moved. The enemy tried to recover, but the momentum was gone. Their movements became reactive, rushed. Ava adjusted faster than they could think, shifting positions despite the pain that flared with every crawl. She felt the blood soaking into her side, warm against the cold. Not catastrophic, manageable. Everything was manageable if you didn't let it speak louder than the mission. She fired again, then again. Shots spaced, never overlapping. She wasn't suppressing. She was erasing options. Below her, Calloway felt the mountain finally exhale. Space opened where there had been none. Air returned to lungs that had been working on borrowed time. Quinn groaned weakly as they hauled him forward, pulse faint but stubborn. "Whoever that is," Brenner said between breaths, "they're buying us time." Ava watched the team close the distance toward better cover. She saw the way they protected the wounded man first, how they moved together despite exhaustion. Something tightened in her chest that had nothing to do with injury. Responsibility didn't end because you were hurt. It intensified. Enemy fire slowed, then stopped entirely. Silence spread across the slope, heavy and unnatural. Snow drifted down onto bodies that wouldn't move again. Ava held her position, rifle steady, scanning for the counter-strike that never came. Then she moved. Each step downhill sent pain lancing through her ribs, but she welcomed it. Pain meant she was still here, still useful, still accountable. She descended carefully, choosing lines that kept her visible only when she wanted to be. The team regrouped below, panting, battered, soaked through. Calloway lifted his head slowly, scanning uphill, disbelief and something more dangerous rising in his chest. A figure emerged through the storm. Not running, not stumbling, walking. Brooks stopped breathing. Brenner straightened without realizing it. Hall reached up and removed his helmet, holding it against his chest like he was back on a parade ground instead of a mountainside littered with the aftermath of violence. The figure stepped into clearer view. Blood darkened one side. The left arm moved stiffly. The face beneath the helmet was calm, focused, unchanged. Ava Monroe didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. Calloway felt his throat close. Training told him to confirm identity. Rank demanded composure. Something older took over. His spine straightened. He found himself standing at attention before he could stop it. Monroe's eyes went straight to Quinn, then to him. Move, she said. The word cut through disbelief like a blade. Discipline snapped back into place as if it had only been waiting for her voice. The team surged into motion, lifting Quinn carefully, weapons covering arcs without being told. No one asked how she survived. No one asked where she had been. Those questions felt irrelevant in the presence of what mattered. That she was there, wounded but unbroken, reclaiming the space she had never truly left. Monroe took rear security, rifle up, pain contained behind calm. She absorbed every breath carefully, refusing to let injury dictate pace. The storm closed in behind them again, but it carried a different silence now. The final push to extraction was a test of endurance more than firepower. Enemy resistance probed, then faltered, uncertain whether the sudden reversal had been luck or leadership. Monroe moved through it without ceremony, pointing, signaling, opening space where it mattered most. Quinn went first. That decision was never debated. Brenner and Hall carried him, careful with weight and balance, moving only when Monroe gave them room. Rounds snapped overhead, but the rhythm was broken. The enemy was guessing now. Guessing got people killed. The aircraft cut through the storm like a promise, rotors tearing the air apart. Snow exploded outward as it settled into the landing zone. Urgency screamed from every gesture of the crew. Monroe held the perimeter alone. She answered the last push with controlled fire, forcing the enemy down long enough for the ramp to stay open. Only when the last man was aboard did she move. She stepped onto the aircraft without hurry, turning to face the storm until the ramp began to rise. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. Blood and cold metal and exhaustion filled the space. Men slumped against the walls, adrenaline draining away. Monroe braced herself against the frame, scanning faces, counting without moving her lips. Everyone accounted for. Yes, Calloway answered. Only then did she close her eyes for half a second. The impact came without warning. Metal screamed. Gravity vanished. The helicopter slammed down hard, rolling, throwing bodies against restraints. The world became noise and force and sudden stillness. For one heartbeat, no one moved. Then Ava Monroe stood up. Sound off, she said, voice calm and absolute. Stay with me. And in the wreckage, leadership rose again. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady enough to hold everyone together when the mountain tried one last time to take them all. Sometimes survival isn't about being unbreakable. It's about standing up anyway. Why did she refuse the stretcher when her body was finally allowed to fail? The crash had left the world tilted, as if gravity itself had lost confidence. Metal groaned as it cooled. The smell of fuel mixed with blood and cold air, sharp enough to sting the lungs. For a moment, no one spoke. Silence pressed in the same way the storm had, heavy, suffocating, daring someone to break it. Ava Monroe broke it first. Sound off. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried certainty, and certainty was oxygen when everything else was burning away. She moved through the wreckage with controlled urgency, checking faces, gripping shoulders, forcing eyes to focus. She counted without speaking, committing each response to memory. Alive, breathing, responsive. Brenner answered with a sharp nod, pain etched deep across his face. His arm hung wrong, but he stayed upright out of habit more than strength. Hall had blood running down his temple, warm against frozen skin, but his eyes were clear. Brooks breathed too fast, shock shaking through him in waves he didn't yet recognize. Quinn moaned. That sound mattered more than anything else. Monroe was beside him in an instant, kneeling despite the protest from her ribs. She adjusted pressure where the medic's hands trembled, not from fear, but exhaustion. She didn't say it out loud, but she saw the signs. He was still hanging on, but barely. Time was thinning. Calloway watched her work, something twisting painfully in his chest. He had given the orders. He had accepted the loss. And now she was here, bleeding, moving like the crash hadn't taken something from her too. "Whose status?" she asked him. He swallowed. Pilot injured, co-pilot unresponsive, aircraft disabled, fire risk low for now. Monroe nodded once. "We secure, we treat, we wait. No panic, no disbelief, just decisions." Outside, the storm reclaimed the wreckage, wrapping it in white. Inside, order returned one instruction at a time. Leadership didn't announce itself. It simply stood when everything else fell apart. When rescue finally came, it felt unreal. Hands reached in. Voices layered over each other. Warmth replaced the biting cold. Monroe didn't resist until they tried to put her on the stretcher. "He goes first," she said, nodding to Quinn. A medic hesitated. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Something in her posture ended the discussion before it began. Only after Quinn was loaded did she allow herself to be examined. The hospital was quiet in a way the battlefield never was. Fluorescent lights hummed softly. The clock read just after 3 in the morning. Outside the trauma bay, the team sat where they had been told, still in torn gear, boots leaving dirty half-moons on the polished floor. Ava Monroe stood with them. She refused the gurney again. Blood had dried along her collar. Her breathing was shallow, measured. Each rise of her chest controlled. She leaned slightly against the wall when she thought no one was looking, then straightened when she felt eyes on her. He goes first, she repeated when the nurse approached. The surgeon didn't argue. Time stretched thin. Calloway replayed every decision he'd made on the mountain, wondering where the line was between responsibility and regret. Brenner stared at the floor, jaw clenched, pain radiating with every pulse. Brooks felt something crack inside him, not fear, not relief, but the slow realization that records didn't matter as much as he'd once believed. The surgeon emerged at last. Stable, he said. He'll recover. Ava closed her eyes, just for a moment, just long enough to let something heavy finally leave her chest. Only then did she sit. The doctor was direct, not gentle. Fractured ribs, concussion, internal bruising, shoulder dislocation already reset, weeks of pain ahead, rest ordered. 48 hours, Ava countered quietly. Debriefs still need to be done. The doctor studied her, then nodded. Compromise reached. No argument necessary. Later, when the hallway had emptied and the noise faded into distant murmurs, Calloway asked the question he'd been carrying since the storm swallowed the ridge. Why did you come back? Ava didn't answer right away. She sat on the edge of the bed, one arm braced, eyes fixed on the floor. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, unadorned. The math said I could help. Probability favored movement. Capability allowed it. She paused. And it wasn't just math. Calloway waited. Responsibility doesn't end when it gets hard, she said. That's when it starts. There was no pride in her words, no expectation they would be remembered. The legend would grow anyway. It always did. But the truth was simpler. She had bled. She had hurt. And she had gone back because leaving would have cost more than pain ever could. Years later, long after the mountain had erased their tracks, a master chief stood before a classroom of new faces and told the story without embellishment. He stripped away the myths. He talked about timing, about decisions made when there were no clean options, about the quiet weight of command. Ava Monroe, never corrected the rumors. She redirected the credit back to the team, back to the ones who carried, covered, and refused to quit. Calloway listened once from the back of the room and understood something he hadn't that day in the storm. Leadership isn't learned when everything goes right. It's learned when everything breaks and you stand anyway. Some strength is loud. The most important kind is silent. Why did the silence feel heavier after the gunfire stopped? Weeks passed, but the mountain did not loosen its hold. Ava Monroe learned that pain has a rhythm. At first it demands attention, sharp and unrelenting, but over time it settles into something quieter, something you can walk with. She moved carefully through recovery, ribs taped, shoulders stiff, lungs burning whenever she forgot herself and breathed too deep. The doctors told her what they always did: slow down, heal, wait. She nodded. She always nodded. Waiting had never been her strength. The team scattered into mandatory downtime medical holds, quiet corners of bases that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. They were alive. That was the victory everyone wanted to talk about. What no one said was how survival rearranged things inside you. Calloway woke most nights to the sound of wind that wasn't there. In his dreams, the ridge collapsed again and again, and each time he made the same decision. He moved downhill. He left her behind. He told himself it was the right call. In daylight, logic still agreed. At night, logic stayed silent. Brooks stopped talking about records. He trained harder than before, pushing himself until instructors noticed and pulled him back. He wasn't reckless, just restless. He had seen how fast certainty vanished, how promises could be erased by weather and gravity. He carried that knowledge like a bruise no one else could see. Brenner's arm healed crooked enough to ache when storms rolled in. He joked about it, but when the wind picked up, his eyes drifted to windows, to ridgelines, to places where angles mattered. He remembered the shots that had come from nowhere. He remembered how close they had been to ending. Ava Monroe returned to duty before she was fully ready. She knew it. The medical staff knew it. But readiness was more than healing bones. It was knowing when you could still be counted on. She moved a little slower now, hid it well. The pain reminded her of the mountain, of how thin the line was between control and chaos. She stood alone during her first briefing back. No one ignored her. That wasn't it. They waited, watched. She felt it in the room, the careful silence, the way people looked at her like she was something fragile or legendary. Both made her uncomfortable. She spoke when she needed to. Short sentences, clear intent. When she finished, the room moved again. Gravity returned to its place. But leadership leaves marks. She noticed them in small moments. The way her hand tightened when someone lagged behind. The way she counted heads more often than necessary. The way her eyes tracked exits even in safe spaces. None of it felt dramatic. It felt responsible. Calloway requested a private meeting he didn't rehearse. He stood across from her, posture straight, words heavier than he expected them to be. "I made the call to move," he said. "I know," she replied. "I believed you were gone." "I know." A silence stretched between them, not tense, just full. "I would do it again," he said finally, "and I hate that." Ava studied him, seeing the weight he carried, the quiet fracture leadership had left behind. "You protected your people," she said. "That's the job. And you came back anyway." She looked away for a moment. "Because I could." That was all. The official reports were clean. Timelines, coordinates, after-action notes stripped of emotion. Her name appeared where it had always belonged. The section marked KIA pending confirmation quietly disappeared. Unofficially, the story grew teeth. People whispered about impossible shots through a storm, about a ghost on the mountain, about a commander who walked out of white death like it had made a mistake. Ava never corrected them. She also never encouraged them. Legend didn't save lives. And discipline did. One evening, months later, she stood alone on a training ridge as wind moved across the rock face in a familiar way. The mountain was different, safer, controlled, but her body remembered. She closed her eyes briefly and felt the echo of that fall, the moment when control had vanished and decision had replaced certainty. She breathed through it. Brooks joined her without speaking. He stood where she had once stood before the collapse. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The storm had taken something from all of them. It had also given something back. Not invincibility, clarity. Ava Monroe understood now that resilience wasn't about refusing to break. It was about accepting that some fractures stayed and choosing to lead anyway. Sometimes dignity doesn't announce itself. It simply acts. Why did she hesitate when they asked her to teach what everyone wanted to learn? The request came without ceremony. A line in an email, a meeting penciled into a schedule already crowded with operations and recovery reports. They wanted her in a classroom, not for tactics alone, but for something harder to define: experience, judgment, the kind of knowledge people believed could be transferred if they sat close enough to it. Ava Monroe didn't answer right away. She stood at the edge of the training range that afternoon, wind tugging at her jacket, watching younger operators cycle through drills she knew by muscle memory. Their movements were sharp, eager, hungry. They wanted certainty. They wanted rules that held when the world fell apart. She wasn't sure she could give them that. Pain still lived in her ribs, dull but present, a reminder that the mountain had taken its toll. She adjusted her stance unconsciously, favoring the side that didn't protest. The body adapts. The mind follows more slowly. Calloway found her there. They're not asking for a legend, he said, reading her silence better than most. They're asking for the truth. She exhaled, slow and measured. The truth isn't neat. No, he agreed, but it's survivable. The first day in the classroom was quiet. Ava stood at the front without notes, hands resting lightly on the table. The faces watching her were attentive, some nervous, some openly curious. They had heard the stories. They were waiting for her to confirm them. She didn't. She talked about preparation that failed, about plans that assumed too much, about whether that didn't care how skilled you were. She talked about fear, not the kind that makes you freeze, but the kind that sharpens you if you let it. She didn't mention her fall. Not yet. When questions came, they were careful, respectful. She answered them directly, but she didn't give comfort where there wasn't any to be had. Leadership, she told them, wasn't about having better instincts. It was about carrying the consequences of your decisions without letting them hollow you out. Later, Brooks lingered after the room emptied. Did you ever think about not going back? He asked, eyes fixed on the floor. Ava considered the question. She didn't rush to soften it. Yes, she said, for exactly as long as it took to realize what staying away would cost. He nodded, absorbing that, understanding something he hadn't known how to ask. As months turned into years, the story changed hands. It lost sharp edges, gained meaning. People stopped asking how she survived and started asking why she led the way she did. She redirected praise like she always had, toward teams, toward preparation, toward the quiet discipline that kept people alive when luck ran out. When promotion came, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like weight. She accepted it anyway. On her last deployment with the unit, the mountain appeared again. Different terrain, different mission. Same thin line between order and chaos. She watched someone else step forward into command, hands steady, voice calm. She didn't intervene. She didn't need to. Leadership had moved on. Later, alone, she felt the familiar ache and allowed herself something she rarely did. Pride. Not in surviving, in what had been passed forward. Because the strongest legacy isn't written in reports or whispered in stories. It lives in the decisions others make when you're no longer there to make them for them. Why did the memory return only when the room was finally quiet? Years later, long after the storm had lost its name, and the mountain had become coordinates in an archive, Ava Monroe sat alone in a dim briefing room that no longer smelled like urgency. The chairs were empty, the screens dark. Outside, the base settled into the kind of calm that only comes after everything important has already been decided. This was where memories waited. She had learned that noise kept them away. Missions, training, responsibility. As long as something demanded her attention, the past stayed folded where it belonged. But silence invited it back. Not the violence, not the gunfire, the moments in between. The sound of wind before the collapse, the feeling of weightlessness as the ledge disappeared, the quiet certainty that followed when panic would have been easier but useless. She didn't fight the memory anymore. She let it sit with her. Across the base, a new class finished their final exercise. She had watched them earlier, unnoticed, standing near the edge of the range where shadows were easy to hide in. Their movements weren't perfect. They didn't need to be. What mattered was how they covered one another, how they slowed when someone fell behind, how they made space instead of rushing into it. They would never know the storm, and that was the point. Calloway had retired the year before. His departure was quiet, deliberate, exactly like the man he had become. On his last day, he'd stood in her doorway longer than necessary. I used to think command was about never being wrong, he said. Now I think it's about being willing to live with being right. She smiled at that, just slightly. Brooks taught now, not doctrine, judgment. He asked questions instead of giving answers. He told his students that courage wasn't loud and survival wasn't proof of worth. He never mentioned records. Brenner sent her a message whenever storms rolled in. No words, just the date. She always understood. Ava remained where she was, not because she needed to be, but because she chose to be. She declined offers that would have taken her away from the people she could still serve. There was no bitterness in that choice, just clarity. One evening, a young officer stopped her in the corridor. Ma'am, he said, hesitant, how do you know when to step forward and when to let others lead? Ava considered him for a long moment. She saw herself there once. The hunger for certainty, the fear of missing the moment that defined you. You step forward when your absence would cost more than your presence, she said. And you step back when someone else is ready to carry it. He nodded, though she knew the answer wouldn't make sense until it had to. Later, as she walked back toward her quarters, the wind moved across the base in a familiar way, not threatening, just present. She stopped and looked out toward the dark horizon where mountains blended into sky. She thought of the fall, not with fear, with gratitude, because it had stripped away everything unnecessary. It had shown her what remained when titles, reputation, and control were taken. It had revealed that leadership wasn't about standing above the storm. It was about choosing to walk back into it when others couldn't. The world would never know the full truth of that day. It didn't need to. The people who mattered carried it forward in how they moved, how they decided, how they protected one another without being told. Ava Monroe turned away from the window and shut off the lights. Some strength announces itself, the kind that lasts doesn't. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.